Ganado Meets Finance. This will be a series of podcasts on various aspects of financial services. My name is André Zerafa. I'm the managing partner of Ganado Advocates in Malta. We have invited industry leaders, practitioners and stakeholders to join us for informal discussions on all that concerns the industry. We felt we should start the series with a discussion on regulation, supervision and also on the future of this industry. Indeed, for the first podcast in this series, we invited Mr. Joseph Gavin, Chief Executive Officer of the MFSA. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks. Thank you, André.
Just to start off with our discussion, Joe, you joined the MFSA 6 months ago, round about 6 months ago. And when you joined, there were obviously, as there are still, a number of challenges ahead. So how has it been the experience at the helm of the MFSA?
It's been a fascinating journey. I arrived in early September, and of course, you have to spend time meeting people, talking to people, understanding the different issues. At that time, of course, the pandemic was still very much up in our minds, and there was the shock of the grey listing, which I think cast a cloud over the financial sector and something of a setback. Very pleased to see that very good progress has been made over the recent past. And I think it's fair to say much of the good work was done during the money valve visits over the previous 2 years. So an awful lot of the work had already been done. So I think that led to some of the disappointment. But it looks like we're on a clear path at this point, which I think gives rise to a much greater sense of confidence among practitioners, participants, regulators, and the industry. What I discovered over the past 6 months is how strong and diversified, well diversified, the financial sector is in terms of banking, insurance, asset management, IT, fintech. So there's a very strong base for continued growth of the sector.
Okay, so you obviously see a major function and the role for the MFSA in the contribution which it can provide for the jurisdiction to, let's say, come back on its feet.
And I think there are a number of aspects to this. One is we need to be seen as an effective regulator. So I think, in terms of being an effective gatekeeper, an effective supervisor, an effective enforcer. But I think there's also a role for us in terms of promulgating change and collaborating in that process with industry and industry participants. So we are committed to supporting industry in terms of identifying growth opportunities and in particular niche growth opportunities. So with that in mind, I took a hand in our asset management strategy, which we delivered before December. And I think that was an example of how we see, the things we need to change in terms of our engagement with the sector, by improving efficiencies in processes, but then also assisting in elaborating or in assisting in changing the framework to allow for, wider opportunities and growth.
Excellent. And in fact, I think in the last few years, we have seen the various industry sectors in financial services in Malta, I would say, consolidating, because we haven't seen as such a shrinking of the industry, but we have seen operators who, let's say, were more serious about their governance, risk and compliance obligations, including also their anti-money laundering obligations, coming to the fore and rising up to the challenge. And I think this would be also in line with the MFSA's supervisory priorities.
I absolutely agree. I think in terms of our supervisory priorities, we want to see that that we're seen to be an effective regulator, and that all helps to have effective firms in terms of capital, governance, compliance, where people take AML, etc., where people take their responsibilities seriously. And that will in itself help to grow the sector and attract new entrants.
Are you seeing anything on the horizon which could be a game changer in financial services? Not necessarily in Malta, even on a global level.
Yeah, I think on a global level, well, there is absolutely no doubt that technology is rapidly overtaking. And I'm not saying we're struggling to keep up, but I think it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. And I think it's probably our biggest challenge in the coming 2 to 3 years, that we need to continue to make short-term changes to continue to ensure that our platforms are effective. We then also need to move to a longer-term position where we've got a much more data-driven approach to supervision.
And even more so, I would say, with the influx, because in case of payment services, I think we've seen an influx, and electronic money institutions in particular, even when one looks at the number of licenses which have been issued, and you compare EMIs to the rest of the whole industry, on a pro rata basis, the biggest increase has been in the licensing of EMI.
Yeah, and it's how you measure the numbers, I think, is an important point. In terms of volume of activity, profitability, etc. So I think that there are great prospects for payment institutions, e-money institutions, and particularly with the development of open architecture under PSD3, you're going to see continued elaboration of new financial intermediated products.
Okay, just to pick on that, traditionally I come from the asset management industry, so that has been my specialization now for a number of years. In my industry, the contact with investors and the investment strategy and the implementation of that investment strategy is key to basically have a business which is doing well, to have a fund which is delivering. And I must say that I've seen several clients struggling in the last few years with new products coming to the market, with the traditional being overtaken by the new. And we keep on going on about innovation, which is extremely important. I think we also need to have regulatory innovation, innovation which is linked to specific sectors in particular, on which I know that the MFSA has been focusing on innovative products which are linked to fintech solutions or not. What is there in the pipeline? Anything interesting?
Well, for example, if we take asset management, I think I'd like to see us in a more competitive position relative to some of the larger jurisdictions. I think there is scope to expand the capacity of Malta financial instruments or legal instruments in comparison with Ireland and Luxembourg, and so I would envisage that niche products like private equity type funds, I think that could be an area of potential for Malta, and I can envisage that we would be happy to adopt the various forms of limited partnership that are most suitable to the particular sector. And that's just an example. So there are other areas, I think, making our processes more efficient, coming up with, for example, a notified PIF, I think would make a big difference.
That would be very welcome, because we've had several requests and several discussions with a number of clients looking at smaller funds, perhaps, which would be regulated at a certain level, not necessarily at the same level.
Indeed, and again, I mean, these are one, institutional funds, two, sub-threshold for AFMD, so we're below the 500 million threshold. And now I know that may be a large sum in Malta, but at the same time, in terms of systemic impact, I think it's well provided for in EU regulation.
Jumping onto another topic, most of our rules today and our legislation in financial services on a public law level is a reflection of EU directives and regulations.
Absolutely.
Regulatory arbitrage has I wouldn't say disappeared entirely, but it has reduced greatly. So we are always on the lookout. The various jurisdictions which are legitimately competing in this area are always on the lookout for a unique selling point. I think the future holds more convergence at EU level. The European supervisory authorities, I think, are becoming stronger. There is an agenda for more convergence happening at an EU level, much more than we've had so far. How do you see this panning out in the next few years, and how would the MFSA fit within this very complex EU supervisory framework?
Nice.
It's a long question.
Nice hard question. We already do fit within it. You're absolutely right. Convergence at the level of ESMA, EIOPA, EBA is occurring rapidly. And it's very much in terms of standardization of reporting, data, so forth. And also in terms of the guidelines that we see in terms of what is considered to be appropriate within the various EU regulations. And I think that's appropriate. Now, compare then the notion of, and I don't particularly like the word regulatory arbitrage. I prefer the idea of competition. And there are various areas of the financial sector that some are much more competitive than others. There's still, in my view, a wide variety of opportunity within the EU legal framework. Jurisdictions, smaller jurisdictions like Malta, to compete effectively with the larger, more established jurisdictions. And we do know, for example, we've had setbacks with the revised AF&D. One may be hopeful that, the next revision may actually, provide opportunities for us. So I think, we'd like to see more proportionality within these revisions that are, that accommodate competitiveness within the EU, because in fact, the EU is founded on open market.
That's right. And the thing is that even the EU is evolving itself, because the EU was also originally founded on subsidiarity. But subsidiarity has flown away because it needed to.
It needed to, indeed. And no better example than Ireland.
I think I can sort of pick on one very important word which you used in the last answer, which is proportionality. And I think proportionality has been probably one of the main points which, as a country, we need to push forward a bit more. But also from the point of view of the client base, from the point of view of the license holder base that we have in the jurisdiction, the rules which are coming out might be disproportionate to the level of the industry we have here, which might be appearing because I think we were quite good at our marketing, especially till around 5 years ago, where we're giving the impression that the industry in Malta might have been much bigger than it actually was.
Yeah.
With people thinking that we are controlling half the economy of the world, and all the trade winds were being controlled from this country, whereas in fact we know that wasn't the case. And proportionality there becomes very important on the application of rules.
It does. Now, we have to marry two things. One is European priority on convergence, and in terms of maximum harmonisation, negotiate revisions to the EU framework where the opportunity arises to put forward the proportionality argument. And I see that it's not like it's a monolith. I mean, I think there's a fear that the ECB, the supervisory board, the EIOPA, ESMA, that they're something of a monolith, of all the larger, dominated by the larger economies. I don't believe that's the case, and I'm aware that there are as many participants at the table who support the notion of proportionality. So I think it's for us to advocate, and I think that's something we could do more of.
So, Joe, what are the MFSA supervisory priorities for the next year or two? I mean, the several documents have been issued by the MFSA very transparently outlining what those priorities are, and it would be interesting for our listeners to hear it from you as well.
Yeah, so I think we have a very comprehensive strategy for in terms of supervisory priorities that we published, I think, just around December, looking at all of the aspects of supervision in terms of, sectoral, horizontal. And so, if I were to try and encapsulate it, rather than go through how I understand, the document, it seems to me that if we look at banking, I think our priority will be to continue to supervise closely. I think we will be looking to a view towards consolidation in the sector, which we are beginning to see, which is a positive thing. We can see that insurance is a very well-established sector here, and it's very well covered by insurance legislation. And we have a good variety of innovative structures. And I would mention in particular the protected cell company legislation, which I think has been a great achievement for Malta. And I think the thing to note about insurance is that it has sustained itself very well through the pandemic. If we turn to payment institutions, we see a great opportunity in terms of, well, there's already significant growth in the sector in terms of volume of payments and activity going through the various regulated firms. And we are very supportive of innovation. Now, when we come to looking at things like innovation, I think the sandbox, I think, is something that's often mentioned. And in my view, the sandbox is more suitable for process than an unregulated institution. So we see very much the opportunity for firms to develop technologies and change the way of doing business. The use of technology that we would encourage, through use of the sandbox. We see the PSD3 being very a big part of this. The financial institution legislation is quite helpful to us in terms of flexibility. So we're very happy with that. And as I said, with respect to our asset management, I think there is great potential for asset management in Malta. And I think there are a number of things we need to improve on, including our legislative framework, our engagement with industry, and the arrival of international depositories.
The arrival of international depositories would be very welcome, or else the opening up of the restriction which exists at the moment at the level of the IFMD, requiring a local depository for the alternative investment fund, which I know is something which at European level this is being considered as well, but it depends very much on negotiation and on the various flexibilities of the different countries involved.
That is absolutely right, and I think it's up to Malta to be to put its best foot forward in terms of negotiation.
I'll probably pick on a topic which has created quite a bit of let's say we gave out a few wrong messages along the way around 2-3 years ago when we started portraying the country as the blockchain island, as the island where crypto operators want to come here and operate from. In truth, the regime we have for virtual financial assets is, I would describe it as, and I'm describing this, I'm coming from a position of knowledge in the sense that I have read and scrutinized as well legislative frameworks and regulatory frameworks of other jurisdictions. Ours is probably the one in Malta is probably one of the best there is in the world. I'm not even saying the EU, the one of the best there is in the world. And the number of operators that we have in the country at the moment, number around 15. There are a few virtual financial assets agents as well, and another 15. So we're looking at, in all, 30 operators. So the industry isn't huge. And I think, on the other hand, that it is strong enough for us to be able to build on what there is at the moment, particularly since our clients keep on mentioning that exposure to crypto assets, not necessarily cryptocurrencies, I'm including anything you can imagine in the term crypto assets, has become extremely important for investors. Any comments you'd like to make on this?
Yeah, we're talking about virtual financial assets, so virtual.
Yeah.
I think one needs to make a clear differentiation between what's appropriate for a retail investor and what's appropriate for an institutional investor. I know, for example, other jurisdictions have banned VFA funds for retail investors. Now, that seems appropriate to me because I think one requires, a strong level of risk appetite and also a good knowledge of trading. We actually, as you say, we do have probably the best developed legislative framework, certainly in Europe. There's no question about that, and it's been modelled on the EU, MiFID directive. So it's and which is now being followed by the EU Commission. One needs to bear in mind that at a global level, there are very different views being taken by central banks and the treasuries of different governments in terms of the utility of VFAs. I think for those, it is a very attractive sector for those who have the appetite, and it's entirely appropriate that we should regulate it. The other interesting thing to bear in mind is that by virtue of regulation, we now, in terms of looking at sources of funds coming into VFAs, have a better handle on those who may be located in sanctioned jurisdictions. So we actually probably have a better picture than many other EU jurisdictions on the entry point of activity for investors.
Great. I think this the point you make on the difference between the professional and the retail investor is also an important point, which we need to keep in mind in various other sectors. So in asset management, for instance, Malta has proven to be more of a professional investor type of offering rather than a retail investor type of offering. One just needs to look at the number of UCITS funds, for example, which are licensed in Malta, as opposed to the number of alternative investment funds or professional investment funds, which we have at the moment. So I think that distinction should remain and will remain in the future as well in other areas.
Oh, I think it's vital. There's a much greater duty of care to a retail investor, whereas in an institutional investor, we can accept is sophisticated and has the capacity to accept the loss. To my mind, there's a material difference, and we are encouraging, there's a cultural change in firms to safeguard retail investors through the various consumer protection policies that we have issued. But to my mind, it's fundamental. A retail investor does not necessarily have the capacity to understand what is being offered.
Yes, unfortunate, but very true. I think which has been very clearly made today is that Malta is open for business. The MFSA is also open for business. It needs to be good business. It needs to be compliant with the expectations, both at EU level but even at a national level. We've had some interesting years, and we've had exponential growth starting from 2008 on to 2016. For that decade, I think that those 8 to 12 years were key in our development. We've seen a bit of consolidation now in the last 2 years in particular, and we're ready for the next challenge. So thank you, Joe. Thank you for being
very
with
much.
us here
And,
today.
Just in conclusion, I would say that the EU has been a terrific platform for the growth of Malta.
Absolutely. So for those listening to us today, look out for the next episodes of Ganado Meets Finance, which are coming up soon.